In 1815, the most powerful men in Europe sat in a room in Vienna and made a decision that would last over 200 years. They weren't trying to help Switzerland. They were trying to build a wall. Switzerland has not fought in a foreign war since 1815. Not World War I, not World War II, not once. And the strange part is, that wasn't an accident, and it wasn't really Switzerland's choice to begin with. So here's the actual question. How does one small country, sitting in the middle of a continent that tore itself apart not once but twice, manage to stay out of it both times? The easy answer is the Swiss are peace-loving people. The real answer is geography, leverage, and a 200-year-old deal that every major power had its own selfish reason to keep alive. Switzerland wasn't always neutral. For centuries, it was actually the opposite. The Swiss cantons were one of Europe's biggest exporters of something every king and emperor needed: soldiers. Swiss mercenaries fought in nearly every major European war from the late medieval period onward. They were famous for it. Disciplined, brutal, and available to the highest bidder. The Pope still uses Swiss guards today, and that's a leftover of exactly this reputation. Neutral wasn't the brand. Reliable hired muscle was the brand. That changed abruptly at the end of the 1700s. Napoleon's France invaded in 1798, dissolved the old Swiss Confederation, and turned the country into something called the Helvetic Republic, which sounds independent, but functioned as a French satellite state. For over a decade, Switzerland wasn't neutral. It wasn't really sovereign either. It was just another piece being moved around someone else's board. Then Napoleon lost, and in 1815, the powers who beat him, Austria, Russia, Prussia, and Britain, along with France itself, sat down at the Congress of Vienna to redraw the entire map of Europe from scratch. This is the part that actually explains everything that came after. When these 4 or 5 powers looked at Switzerland, they weren't thinking about Swiss independence as a moral cause. They were thinking about it as a buffer. Switzerland sits in the middle of the continent, wedged between France and Austria, historically 2 of the most likely powers to go to war with each other. A neutral, defensible block of mountains sitting exactly between them meant that neither one could stage an army there, march through, or use it as a launching pad against the other, without breaking an agreement that every other major power had also signed on to. In other words, neutrality wasn't a gift to Switzerland. It was a tripwire, built for everyone else. If Switzerland stayed untouched, no single power could quietly gain a military advantage by walking through it. That made neutrality genuinely useful to multiple competing empires at the same time, which is the actual reason it got written into the Congress of Vienna's final declaration in 1815, guaranteeing Switzerland's perpetual neutrality permanently. Not because Switzerland was loved, because the deal benefited everyone holding the pen. A piece of paper, though, is only as strong as the next century willing to honor it, and the 20th century tested this agreement twice under the worst possible conditions. World War I was the first real test. By 1914, Switzerland was surrounded on every side by countries actively at war with each other: France, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. Switzerland's response wasn't to stay passive. It mobilized its army at the borders, fully prepared to fight. Not to join the war, but to make any invasion through its territory expensive enough that nobody on either side thought it was worth trying. Neutrality, in this case, wasn't pacifism. It was armed deterrence. Nobody invaded, and the deal held. World War II pushed the test much further. After France collapsed in 1940, Switzerland was almost entirely encircled by Axis-controlled territory. Germany to the north, Italy to the south, occupied France to the west. Historians have confirmed that Nazi Germany did in fact draw up invasion plans for Switzerland under the codename Operation Tannenbaum. So the obvious question is, why didn't it happen? Part of the answer is genuinely geographic. The Swiss military adopted something called the Raidui strategy, essentially conceding that an invader could likely take the lowland cities, but planning to retreat into heavily fortified positions deep in the Alps and make any continued occupation brutally slow, costly, and possibly endless. Mountain warfare against a country that spent generations preparing for exactly that scenario is not an attractive proposition for any general.
But terrain alone doesn't fully explain it. The more uncomfortable answer is that neutral Switzerland was simply more useful to Germany functioning than occupied. Switzerland's banks moved and held capital that all sides relied on. Its factories supplied precision tools and machinery, including components used in war production, to multiple sides of the conflict simultaneously. And its neutral territory gave intelligence services on all sides a place to quietly operate, gather information, and occasionally negotiate away from the front lines. This is the part of the story that doesn't fit neatly into a flattering narrative, and a fair explainer has to say it directly. Staying useful to every side in a war is not the same thing as staying innocent in one. Switzerland's neutrality kept it out of direct conflict, but it also meant continuing financial and material relationships with a regime the rest of the world was actively fighting to destroy. After the war, and especially decades later, historians and even the Swiss government itself opened serious investigations into exactly how much of that wartime business crossed the line from pragmatic neutrality into something closer to complicity, particularly around looted assets and dormant bank accounts tied to Holocaust victims. There's no single clean answer here, and a neutral explainer about Switzerland's neutrality has an obligation not to pretend there is one.
After 1945, the original reason for Switzerland's neutrality, keeping France and Austria from fighting through its territory, mostly stopped being relevant. Europe wasn't on the verge of another continental war between those specific powers anymore. So the natural question is why the policy survived for another 80 years instead of quietly disappearing. The answer is that neutrality found a new job. During the Cold War, a neutral country sitting physically between NATO-aligned Western Europe and the Soviet bloc became valuable for an entirely different reason. It was a place both sides could use to talk without either one losing face. Geneva, in particular, became one of the world's default cities for diplomatic back channels, arms control talks, and quiet negotiations, precisely because it belonged to nobody's military alliance. Neutrality stopped being primarily a wall keeping armies apart and became something closer to a permanently rentable meeting room. Which brings the story to right now, and to the question that actually has no settled answer yet. In 2022, after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Switzerland did something it had avoided doing for the entire Cold War. It adopted European Union sanctions against Russia. For a country whose entire 200-year identity rests on never explicitly picking sides, that was a significant, debated, and for some Swiss citizens, controversial decision. Supporters argued that selectively enforced neutrality that allows financial safe harbor for sanctioned wealth isn't really neutral at all. Critics argued that breaking 2 centuries of consistent policy undermines the entire point of being a trusted neutral party in any future conflict. So here's where this actually leaves us. Switzerland's neutrality was never really a reflection of Swiss values or a uniquely peaceful national character. It was a deal, one that has been renewed generation after generation, only because the major powers around it kept finding new reasons to need it intact. The real question going forward isn't really about Switzerland at all. It's whether the rest of the world still needs a room that belongs to nobody. If that need disappears, 200 years of neutrality could end up being a historical accident with an expiration date, not a permanent feature of how Europe works.